favorite topics. Thank you, Amy. I love this conference because of the diversity of issues, quite frankly, and the warmth. This is an extraordinary gathering. So we're going to talk for about 45 minutes. And the context for this entire conversation. Oh, is there a clicker, or how do I advance? So look, there's no question that globally and especially in the U.S., we're going through something right now. I don't know what you'd call it. The previous panel talked about courage, which I think is a very powerful word. You know, you can call it activism, you can call it engagement. I think the central issue I'd love for all of you to be thinking about as we speak, is this the new normal? Is it an aberration? Is it a reaction? What is it? Again, my background, the most important thing that I bring to this conversation is a deep and abiding respect for engagement in innovative ways that gets you to entertainment and things like that. So, and you'll hear that represented on the panel. So, you've all seen the news in the press the past year, from the kids at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas to the Women's March. You know, this is a form of activism. This, you know, some people would call this the resistance. I'm not sure it's that, but what I love is it extends through every aspect, all of our sectors in life. So trust me, if you're GE, if you're Jeff Immelt chairman, you don't want to come out against any administration on any issue, and yet he came out on climate change. If you are Mark Benioff over at Salesforce.com, trust me, you don't want to go against the government on anything, but he came out in support of DACA. So we see this in the corporate sector, and something for all of you to be thinking about is, if you're the CMO and your CEO comes out, what just happened to the brand? Because brands are not static, they're dynamic. Same thing with municipalities, the work of Jerry Brown and Mayor Mike Bloomberg in building activism and a coalition around climate change. And then, of course, brands like this, and several of the panelists will talk about the campaigns that we've seen in the past year in the outdoor sector. All of you probably saw weeks ago, and I know the group very well, the work of Lonely Whale, Dune Ives, Adrienne Grenier. They really rocked it. They got Starbucks, as you know, to ban all plastic straws. But guess what? Within the 24-hour cycle, news cycle after that, Marriott changed their policy, and so did American Airlines. I happened to be with JetBlue the day after, and they were discussing it. And you see this through film and entertainment. We have Ted, who will talk about Vulcan. The group I know is Chasing Coral, Chasing Ice. If you haven't seen those films, they're extraordinary. What I love is Jeff Orlovsky, the director, built a social purpose campaign underneath the film. So they screened Chasing Ice in red states, and they had some success flipping the points of view of certain red congressmen on climate. So where does this all come from? And the previous panel talked about trust. Trust is absolutely underneath this. This is old data. This is 2 or 3 years old. But the current data continues with the trend. The trend is as follows. Trust in governments and media continues to go down. People are betting more and more on NGOs, trust in NGOs, and trust in the private sector to do good in the world. And of course, we know the role of social media ever since Arab Spring. When we think about activism, when we think about engagement, when we think about protests, we think about the role of social media. And then finally, we know the other causal factor, without a doubt, are millennials. And it's funny, years ago, and I made this mistake also, I used to think about millennials, pat them on the head, push them off, right? Millennials are a complete driving force nowadays. They're the largest voting bloc in the US. They're the largest labor force in the United States. So they have declared very loudly their preference for brands that have social purpose, and they've expressed their preference for companies that have social purpose where they can express their values. I'll leave you with this. This is a quote from a study that Case Foundation did recently, and I thought it was interesting and it was relevant for this conversation. They say, for millennials, taking consistent positive actions every day or a week is a life cycle and a fundamental part of their identity. In changing how change is made, members of this generation no longer see themselves as activists like their parents, but rather as everyday change makers. So for all of you, you know, when we talk about engagement, when we talk about campaigns, when we talk about activism, I would advise you to think about how are millennials looking at this. I live in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. I'm surrounded by 25, 28-year-old kids, and trust me, they look at this differently. They look at this as a badge of courage, a definition of their personal brand. They don't talk about, I protested this last Saturday, right? They talk about every day, with every single action they do, how are they trying to make a difference in the world, and how is that an expression and an extension of their personal brand. Two groups I just want to put on your radar really quickly. Many of you probably know Global Citizen. So I'm showing you two groups that social activism, building campaigns is in their DNA. Global Citizen claims to have a community of 8 or 9 million globally that care, change makers. And then I think sometimes we forget about change.org, and I was stunned when I looked at the latest number. Change.org would argue that they have mobilized 243 million people through their campaigns that they have on their site. So, I leave you with this. This is an age of courage. It's an age of engagement. You're going to hear from the four panelists kind of their perspectives on this. So I'll start by introducing Ted, who is Director of Engagement and Impact for Vulcan Productions, which several of you know well. His specialty is strategy and communications. He has 20 years of experience in building campaigns, working on advocacy and social marketing. So Ted, why don't you take it away? Do you need a?
Let's see. I think I'm good because all I'm going to show is the clip. If we have that ready, but I'll say a few words first. So thanks to Jeff for hosting us on the panel, and thanks Amy and for the rest of the folks here at the Sun Valley Institute. It's my first time up here, and it's just amazing what you guys have put together here. So thanks so much for that. Like Jeff said, my name is Ted Richane, and I help run a production company called Vulcan Productions, which is based in Seattle. I myself live in Los Angeles, but what I thought I would do to start off is show a teaser for a film that hasn't come out yet. We hope to have news on when it's going to come out this fall, very shortly. And you guys are the first folks to actually see this teaser. We're not quite sure what we're going to do with it in the whole marketing campaign for the film, but I thought I'd share it with you all to sort of tee up a little bit of what I have to say today.
ธาตุที่ผมเคยได้ยินมาตอนที่ดูหนังเมื่อ100 ปีที่แล้วผมคิดว่ามันจะไม่มีอีก
គឺខ្ញុំនៅលើទូកហ្នឹងរយៈពេល7-8ឆ្នាំ6ឆ្នាំជាងចាស់
หางกระเบียนมีถูกตีรองน้ำ
ตามไปเนี่ยตีใหญ่ๆไปที่ใหญ่เอาเลยอ่ะด้วยเองใหญ่เขาอยู่ข้างนอกมันมาดูเป็นนักเลงเยอะมากเลยมีทั้งตำรวจด้วยเขามีอยู่วงการของเขาเป็นนายหน้า
ตรงนั้นเราก็เริ่มรู้ตัวแล้วว่าเราอาจจะรอดหรือเปล่า
คนที่กลับมาจากเรือเนี่ยมันเหมือนไม่ใช่คนอะเหมือนผีดิบที่เดินได้อะ
ปลาที่พวกคุณบริโภคอยู่มันเป็นน้ำพักน้ำแรงของลูกเรือประมงที่ไม่เคยมีเสียง
នឹងកៅតៃស្មួ
So like I said, the film's called Ghost Fleet, and it's going to come out hopefully this fall, and I'll come back and talk a little bit about that. But first, so Vulcan Productions, a company founded by the co-founder of Microsoft, Paul Allen. It's part of a bigger company called Vulcan, which, like I said, is based in Seattle. And Vulcan is really an interesting organization that came about when Paul left Microsoft to really sort of explore and bring to life some of the ideas he had. And we are when we look at problems and issues, we look at Vulcan Productions and the work we do with storytelling as one of 3 main levers that we use. I'll come back to the storytelling piece. The first one is technology and product and philanthropy. The second one is policy change and the work that we do at the state and local and federal and even international levels to change policy. And the third is, of course, the storytelling. So I thought I would give a little bit of an example of a film we worked on a couple of years ago called The Ivory Game. Paul, for those of you who are familiar with some of his philanthropic work, has been very involved with elephant conservation and anti-poaching and fighting wildlife trafficking all across the world. We had the great opportunity to work on a film called The Ivory Game, which wound up being a Netflix original and released in November of 2016. But the way that we actually had the most impact with that film was to work with my colleagues at Vulcan who work in our policy and in our technology and philanthropy divisions. And so in addition to releasing that film, we also had a number of ongoing efforts to change policy at the federal and international levels on the ivory trade issue. We were also releasing technology technology and product, something called the Great Elephant Census, which was the first of its kind count of all the elephants in Africa, both how many we've lost, but also where they've moved to. And so when we put that film out into the world, like I mentioned, Netflix wound up buying it. Leonardo DiCaprio came on as an executive producer. It did really well commercially and was shortlisted for an Oscar. But the impact that we had, and this goes to something that I think we'll talk about hopefully in this panel, is it actually wasn't here in the United States, right? Not too many of you are in the market for ivory, right? I hope. And not too many of you are involved in the supply chain of bringing ivory from East Africa to China. But in those two places, East Africa and China, it's a story that needed to be heard. And so while we're thrilled with the impact that we had in terms of awareness and getting people to understand this issue in the West, what we did, where I believe we had the most impact, was bringing the film to East Africa and to China, where people actually didn't know the facts about this issue and I think learned them. And ultimately, it really helped with a number of other organizations who've worked on this, NGOs who've worked for Wild Aid specifically on the ground for years in China, to bring about their announcement that they're closing their ivory trade. And so I want to keep my comments to a limit here because I know we're going to explore some of these issues. But documentaries, as you all know, are in a bit of a renaissance right now. Nonfiction programming is popular. Netflix, Discovery, Hulu, Amazon, they're all looking for ways to bring these stories to audiences, and they're doing that because people want them. There's a real interest in it. And so when we look at story, we really look at it as a really interesting opportunity to engage with people. But like Jeff said when he introduced me, my job then is to think about how do we take that content and put it to work? How do we work with NGOs, with other organizations, like folks who are up here on the panel with me, to help them put the content and the story to work in a way that will not just activate people, but also sort of have them sort of realize how they can be part of the solution long term. And so the last thing I'll say, which I think is something that'll come back in our conversation here, is around audience. We talk a lot about, and Jeff touched on it, who are we trying to reach with this content? And we'd have that conversation with ourselves all the time. Who is the best audience? And to be honest, sometimes with a documentary film, you could say, I want to reach 5 million people. But the most impactful thing that you might be able to do might reach 6 senators, right, on the right committee, and that actually could be the way to actually move the needle. Now, I hate telling that to my filmmaking partners who, spend, years of their life actually pouring themselves into a story that they could pull off change in just a minute with one meeting. But those are the conversations we have to have. Who are we trying to reach? How are we going to reach them? And how are we going to position content in a way that will be most impactful? So there's a lot more I can say, but I think we'll get into that part of the conversation when we get into conversation.
Thanks, Ted. And Chase, why don't you tell us your story?
Sure. My name's Chase Huntley. I work with the Wilderness Society in Washington, D.C. While they're pulling the slides up here. Our work for 80 years has focused on protecting wilderness and inspiring Americans to care for wild places. My role in that, though, is kind of unique. I'm not the guy that works on protecting places. I'm the guy that works on finding balanced ways to put public lands to work, increasingly with an eye toward solving climate change, but traditionally in finding a way to keep rural economies moving while we're building conservation into future economic plans. The Wilderness Society, like a lot of conservation organizations, I think, is restructuring its program, not just because of the election, but I think that the results of the election were a catalyst for us realizing just how hollowed out our advocacy strategies and campaign strategies have become. We've become superbly good at building echo chambers over the last 8 to 10 years, losing sight of conversations with folks on the ground. The number of pop-up entities that have been created with 8 to 12 members, but with the veneer of speaking for an entire population, it became a cottage industry. And the number of contracts that were out there were astonishing. That all ground to a halt when we realized that we were left somewhat powerless with the unexpected results in November of 16. And in the space where I work in particular, which is at the intersection of public lands conservation, energy development, and climate change, it was clear it was going to be ground zero for a very, very difficult knife fight, and we were simply not prepared. So like a lot of organizations, we've kind of rebuilt the way we're focusing things and with the goal of making sure that we're bringing all of America into the conversation. And in our case, it's a lot about making sure that public lands and conserved public lands in particular are accessible for all Americans. And the work I do is making sure that we keep economic development in the picture. So it's not an either-or choice. It's really a bigger question about the economic future you want to have. A little bit about federal protected public lands. I know Hillary did a great job yesterday talking about public lands in general and the opportunity that they provide as a platform for experimentation, innovation, but also for problem solving, where you have a single landowner and you can put big projects out there with not as much work as you might put in. This is a map of the U.S. public lands, and I'm not breaking it out by land management agency, because most people wouldn't know where BLM lands were, the Bureau of Land Management lands. I think the most important piece here is just that it's 635 million acres that we all own, and not that much of it's protected. But with 635 million acres, you're talking about a third, roughly, of the surface area of the United States. That's a surface area equal to Florida, California, and Alaska combined. So think about the scaling opportunity we have to take some of the innovative ideas Hillary was talking about and put them on the ground in places that are some of the most economically hard hit in America, places where poverty rates and unemployment rates are still skyrocketing, places adjacent to Native American communities. So there's a huge opportunity, but that's not really the direction we're heading in right now, unfortunately. I don't want to get too political, but it's kind of my job. So I'll just say at the outset, we'll recognize that no one party has a monopoly on bad ideas. But unfortunately, this Interior Department has kind of cornered the market on some of them right now. And we're trying to respond to that fact. One of the big ideas that's being pushed is this idea of energy dominance, that our public lands really are there for the taking. They're there for the use, principally of extractive industries, especially the oil, gas, and coal industries. And you weave that into the Make America Great Again themes of the administration, and you're getting a real doubling down on this idea that we should be putting our public lands to use in the same way we were in the 1920s as we are now as we approach the 2020s. And so that's where I'm working, and that's really for context. Let's talk a little bit about how we're responding. Traditionally, the conservation community would approach this kind of situation with what I'll affectionately call landscape porn. We'll take big, luscious pictures of beautiful places that are intended to be evocative of a spiritual connection, that are intended to be inspirational, and draw people in along a simple formula. Put the values out there, talk about the threats, and speak to the opportunities. You know, this is a beautiful landscape photo by Florian Schultz, an amazing photographer of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, an area that right now is the closest it's ever been to being leased or drilled. What you don't see in this picture, though, is what the campaign we're running along with many other conservation organizations is really about. It's protecting the subsistence rights for the Gwich'in Nation, a binational native nation that stretches across the border of US and Canada that relies on the porcupine caribou herd. Again, not pictured in this picture. But they are caribou-dependent people. 85% of their calories comes from harvest of the caribou herd, and there's no question that development in this place is going to have a big impact. So, you know, we're still putting this kind of material out because it's a product that a lot of our traditional base expects. It gives us a good platform from which to draw media attention, and obviously gives us some collateral to use in conversations, but it's not the future of where we're headed. Where we're headed is going to be different kind of tactics, ways to reach millennials through guerrilla tactics, like a pump jack that we have traveling the nation right now, very quietly, but popping up in unexpected places that are simply not where we should be drilling for oil and gas. In this case, 100 feet from about 500 feet under Park Service rules from the Washington Monument. We also have poster campaigns that accompany that. This is one that ran in the neighborhood of the Interior Secretary on his walk and his running route to his local coffee shop, just trying to drive home the fact that not only are we looking to make the energy company the most dominant user of public lands, we're doing it at fire sale prices for less than $2 an acre in many cases. And we're finding that our engagement and penetration rates with millennials are increasing as we have more of these hands-on tactics. But we're still experiencing tremendous amount of fatigue, and it isn't just the issues we work on. There's a long parade of horribles that is really making it difficult to get the activist engagement that we're looking at. Traditionally, 8 to 12% is the rate we would be looking at as a return on an action. We were down below 2% until we started trying to hyper-target. We'll skip past this and just say we're using data we have on the existence of energy development facilities to drive engagement, in this case a comment process in Colorado around methane regulations. We looked at where oil and gas facilities are, mapped out where people live, and found 4,800 people in voter lists that were within a mile of those facilities. We texted them all, taking a page from the Sanders campaign, using a peer-to-peer texting app, and we found engagement rates there were north of 30%. So we're having to innovate, but it's resource intensive, and we're having to learn while we're doing it. It's not the tradition we come from. The real opportunity, I think, going forward, and then I'll pass it on, is building a bridge with the climate community. Public lands, conservation, and climate are not competitors, but for a long time were not very clearly linked. We've done a lot of analysis trying to make that link, and this graph just shows the trajectory that the emissions associated with public lands energy are on. About 20% of our total U.S. greenhouse gas footprint can be accounted for in the carbon content of the oil, gas, and coal coming out of public lands and waters. And we're not only looking at that macro level, we're looking at where coal goes. 36 states in America benefit from subsidized coal pulled out of the Powder River Basin, Wyoming, stretching all the way to Maryland, Michigan. And we're starting to work with those communities to make the connection between urban populations and the source of their energy. So building a supply side conversation, a supply chain conversation about public lands. But the material flow accounting and analysis hasn't been done. So we're still trying to get those studies together. And then I think the last opportunity we have is to think about the corporate side. There's real risk, I think, in participating blindly in this administration's fire sale, because you're going to find yourself, companies will find themselves purchasing places that simply shouldn't be developed, and very quickly we'll wake up to an outcry from tribal communities and a very motivated public with brand risk and I think real material risk for projects in the long run. So it's a conversation we're starting to have with private equity investors and hopefully many of you while I'm here. So with that, I'll pass it on.
Great, thanks. And so next up is Devon from Futerra.
Hi. Are these? Oh, 1 minute, okay. So I guess while they're getting the slides up, I'm Devon Leahy. I head up the strategy practice at a change agency called Futerra. And I've spent the last 10 years working at what I'll call the sustainability marketing divide. And I've done that at places like Walmart, where I've worked both in marketing and sustainability supply chain, and at Etsy, and for clients like Target and REI. And today I have the great fortune of doing that work, working at that intersection of sustainability and marketing at Futerra. We're an independent, mission-driven, majority female-owned change agency. And our mission is really simple, making sustainability so desirable it becomes normal. And when we say sustainability, we don't just mean environmental protection, but all the sort of things that go along with that. And we do that work, I'd say, essentially through corporations that are our clients, nonprofits, and foundations. And the way that we do that is through bringing together the logic of sustainability strategy with the magic of amazing creative. And we believe that the key ingredients for the sort of best combination of logic and magic is setting a vision, so you know the path that you're going down, really imagining what a future could look like, and I'll show some examples of that, and then really building out the strong action implementation plans you need to make that happen, and combining that with symbols or brands that really make things matter, and telling stories that take people with you. And I'm going to share just a few examples of what some of the work that we've done, what good engagement can look like. And I think what we really strive to do across the board is make the things that mean the most matter the most. So climate change, human rights, these are the things that science and research and human instinct tell us are really important, that they mean a lot. But they are not necessarily the things that the everyday consumer feels matters to their everyday life. But what's exciting is that we can use great marketing and communication and engagement in the same way that today we feel like maybe we can't live without portable carbonated beverages. That was great marketing that told us we couldn't live without that. We also can't live without biodiversity and polar ice caps and and economic equality. So these are using the same tools we've used to make those things that we feel like we can't live without, bringing that to these issues. So I'll just share, I guess, two more points that you'll see throughout these examples. We think some sort of to boil down our approach. we like to think about the shift between talking about environmental, social, economic issues at sort of Google Earth view and bringing it down to Google Street View. We live in Google Street View, and a lot of the issues that we all work on are really, the solutions are designed at Google Earth View, and we really have to do a lot of work to translate them. The other is really understanding and knowing our audiences, and whether you're talking to aspirational consumers that are millennials, as we've just been discussing, or you're talking to the sort of hard won, the hard to win over consumer or citizen, you really have to really tailor your message. So you'll see some examples of how we've done that through some of our work. Last year, sort of on the tails of the Paris Climate Agreement, and really looking last year at what we as Futerra were going to do around the Paris around Climate Week. We really wanted to try to find a way to build momentum and build a consumer-facing campaign around climate change. And our founder, Solly Townsend, had just published a book and really built a really deep knowledge around sort of the insights around, like, excuse me, our human need for optimism and hope. And this idea that, in order for us to solve climate change, we actually have to believe that we can solve it. And I'll just share a quick. So this was, this campaign, we launched an online platform, a sort of a multi-platform social campaign. We launched at the main stage at Climate Week, and we had support working with the climate group, but also from some of our clients and corporate friends, VF Corp, Mars, Interface, and a number of others. And this is, it's something that I think still believe has a lot of legs, but it really demonstrates this sort of shift in the way that we engage and talk to consumers about an issue like climate change. We've also done a lot of work with REI over the last few years, and most recently sort of came to face this question of, how can we convince Americans to choose a life outdoors? We talk about the sort of long march indoors that our species has experienced, and if we stop spending time in nature, and this really speaks to also the work around public lands, if we stop spending time in nature, we're less likely to care about it, to want to work to protect it, and so you sort of see this this spiral, and we also know there are major sort of societal, physical, emotional impacts that we are experiencing from spending 95% of our time indoors. 50% of young people have mental health issues. On average, children spend between 4 and 7 minutes a day playing outside. I mean, as a parent, those types of statistics just like sort of shake me to my core, and I can go on. If you want more scary statistics like that, you can go to REI's blog and read about the path ahead. But really what we're at this point now is choosing a different path. So we also know that spending 20 minutes outside can help children sort of address the symptoms of attention deficit. So we've seen, I think, 1.6 million person increase at our public lands and parks just last year. So we see indications that there is a path forward that does not mean we're going to, that 95% is going to go to 98% in 5 years, but that we can actually turn the tide. So we've really built out a thought leadership platform with REI that will bring together new partners, educators, healthcare professionals, nonprofits and government to really chart this path forward and to choose to live a life outdoors. And again, we see evidence of this happening, rewilding of cities, and things like that. So really, again, this reframe. This is a campaign, Fashion Revolution, that Futerra started working on after the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh. And this is an interesting example of how to think about targeting an audience. And it's, the idea was that let's take the fashionistas, the pro-fashion consumers, and make them care about safety and labor issues in the apparel supply chain, which is not something that fashion brands, particularly after Rana Plaza, knew how to do, really wanted to. And we launched this campaign on social media and run it every year on Fashion Revolution Day, so it's sort of now on the calendar. There are thousands of fashion brands and consumers who participate in it. With this question, we had consumers ask on social media, who made my clothes? And fashion brands responded. Last year, over 2,500 fashion brands responded to consumers. We've had hundreds of millions of consumers reached across 62 countries, and this happens annually. And it really has started to change to close that divide between pro-fashion consumers and really serious issues like safety and labor issues in the supply chain. The last example I'll share is a project that we just launched in the last month, which we're calling the Good Life Goals. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is an example, again, of that Google Earth view to Google Street View. We have this sort of amazing set of 17 goals that globally we know we have to work on, but we don't have a way to make them sort of accessible and engaging for consumers. And so we've started this project, and would encourage any of you who are interested in this to talk to me about it afterwards, where we essentially take each SDG and we look at how it might translate into a sustainable lifestyle goal. So quality education from a lifestyle perspective might be around learning and teaching, clean water and sanitation, I can save water, washing hands, sustainable communities, sustainable cities and communities, loving where you live. And I'll just show a quick clip here. I'll just end with that. This is a project that we'll be co-creating with UNEP and all of these other partners and corporates and brands who are interested in co-creating what those actions are, engaging their consumers in really concrete ways that they can contribute to the SDGs and reach our goals for 2030. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. And then finally, Brody, you heard a little bit from Brody earlier yesterday, so why don't you tell us what you're up to and how you think we could be building engagement.
Hello again, I'm Brody. I'm one of 100 million millennials that are now making up the biggest sector of the voting population in the country, 28%. And a large portion of those people contribute to the half of the country's population, 145 million people that say they recreate outdoors on a regular basis. And I think we feel as though a lot of those people may feel disenfranchised, or at least not included in the traditional environmental organizations, the traditional environmental messages that are surrounding the climate change movement. And we are trying to bring those people in through this organization called Protect Our Winters. We're trying to mobilize not only the winter sports community, but the general outdoor community to become effective climate advocates. And if we can do that through our organization and then introduce them to more developed, older organizations such as the Nature Conservancy or the Wildlife Society, or the Wilderness Society, excuse me, I think we will have achieved our goal. But we have a lot of people to reach, so we do so through social media, we do so through traditional media, and we've got a film to show you.
The research finds that 2015 was the warmest year.
Hottest January warmest ever recorded.
Hottest on record around the planet.
High temperatures since record keeping began in 1880.
So we make the recreational argument to our constituents and to the fans of the outdoor industry, and we make the economic argument to the politicians that we go and speak with in DC. Every year we find ourselves in Washington, D.C., a bunch of professional athletes, and we find ourselves in our local legislator's office. We find ourselves all over trying to spread this message because we're finding that we as millennials and we as outdoor recreationalists, like many of you, we don't want stuff. We want to have these experiences and these memories, and we want things that we can preserve for longer than just a piece of plastic. I mean, I just turned 30 recently, and my girlfriend, she gave me a sustaining membership to NPR.
Do you get a tote bag?
I'm like, we have a house. We need stuff, right? She's like, yeah, but we're supporting NPR. I'm like, they're playing either way, right? But it's like this movement that we are seeing, and it's something that I think organizations like Protect Our Winters are trying to build on the foundation of these pre-existing environmental organizations to help bolster the movement and hopefully introduce the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands outdoor recreationalists to the existing movement. So thanks so much for letting me be here, guys.
Great. So in the interest of time, and we're going to run about 5 minutes over, but please be prepared with questions. If anyone has questions, please ask. There are a couple of you I might call on, actually, like Jeff, because I know he's very much in this space. So a question to the panel, and I'll use myself as a case study. I grew up in Brooklyn, urban. Born in Barbados, grew up in Brooklyn. So how much of this conversation do you all think is relevant if I'm living in the Bronx, in West LA, in downtown Chicago? And do you think the movement is doing enough to reach those constituents? I'll start with Ted.
Yes, it's important, and no, it's not doing enough. I think that my sense is that when we think about issues and you look at, we're doing a lot of work around coral reefs right now, and we did a lot of research into how people prioritize the plight of reefs. And that's just an example of where, even among environmentalists, right, it ranks much lower than other sort of issues you see in the headlines: sea level rise, forest fires, things that address or are relevant right in front of you. Not too many people have a coral reef right outside their house. I think similarly, and we talked about this a little bit more earlier as a group, I think similarly, those who, to use your example of living in the South Bronx, a parent there has just the same interest of having clean air and clean water as a parent who lives here in Idaho, right? Or who lives in a more stereotypical, left Berkeley, right? Sort of, but you know, that stereotypical example in the South Bronx of that family there might have other immediate concerns that are right in front of their face. We heard before about poverty, right, in the panel before here. Other issues with housing. And so we, I think, have to be able to sort of talk about these issues not in the sort of broad perspective of polar bears and things like that. I love polar bears, right? But I think, how these issues are important to those who are living everywhere. Clean air. Clean water. We've all watched what's happened in Flint over the last couple of years. And I think there are organizations, some of them are represented about here on this panel, who are doing more and more work and not think about the environmental movement as something that's all about, again, the polar bears or wildlife or public land porn, as you called it before. But really thinking about environmentalism as a justice issue. And I think if we can reframe it that way through story and through examples and through the leadership of those who are not, who people can identify with, who are not bringing someone from Berkeley to go speak to a bunch of kids in the South Bronx, but bring someone from the South Bronx to go talk to someone in the South Bronx, to use your example. And I think that's those are the lessons we've learned from other movements in the past, and I think it's going to be really important for this one too.
Great. And Chase, your experience?
Yeah, I'd completely agree. I mean, I think as an organization, we've realized that we need to move our public face from promoting values to protecting rights and defending rights. And we feel like it's what we've been doing, but may have lost sight of that in the way we deliver the message, the narratives we captured. And I think for us, it is about going back to our roots as an organization. We were a regional organization that just happened to be created in Washington, D.C., became a D.C.-based organization that just happened to have offices in places. We need to invert that pyramid again. I think the biggest thing, though, the storytelling is incredibly important, but it's also finding tailored points of engagement. And that's, a lot of what we've been working through is how do you take federal or even regional and state policies and find ways to make those directly relevant. The stories open eyes, and it's presenting motivated individuals with the right moment and that point of engagement that's immediately relevant to them. And doing that through data, not just analysis of a problem, but analysis of the system. Where do you take that power? How do you apply it in a way that's going to actually effectuate the change you want, if it's blocking or redirecting policies, rather than just making a loud noise. Loud noise is important, but applying that power precisely and in a way that's directly relevant, I think is the big challenge we're facing over the next 2 years.
And then let's talk about political diversity. How many people feel as though things are better in terms of a bipartisan conversation on climate? Show of hands. Better today. How many people feel it's worse today? Okay, so to that point, what happens when you, Brody, go up on Capitol Hill and you're talking to both sides of the aisles? Tell me about your learning, your experience, and do you think that your initiative is bipartisan in its approach?
It is bipartisan in its approach. By its very nature, we are trying to reach across the aisle to bring the people that aren't necessarily on the far other side, but maybe are more centrist. We're trying to bring them to our side because, especially with how divisive the political situation is right now, we're giving up on getting the climate deniers. We're giving up. I think like a lot of the climate movement is kind of giving up on those people. And instead, we're realizing that so many people are either stuck in the middle or leaning toward our side that we're trying to unify them to bring a more uniform voice, I think, and to be more effective. And we're doing that by diversifying not only politically, but the outdoor industry is embracing the fact that we can't just talk about landscape porn anymore. We have to talk about the fact that people live in the Bronx. People live in New Orleans. We have these people that are experiencing the outdoors in ways that is not the traditional way of experiencing outdoors. The Outdoor Industry Association had this tool where, because the LWCF, Land Water Conservation Fund, is currently at risk of not being completely refunded. And they were trying to rally the outdoor industry and all of its consumers behind, let's try to talk to your elected officials to get the LWCF refunded. How do we do this? We have to make people care about it. How do you make people care about it? Well, you point out the fact that there is LWCF-funded land in every county in America. So it doesn't matter if you live in New York City or it doesn't matter if you live in Florida. You are within, a stone's throw of LWCF land that you've most likely stepped out on. And those people are not traditionally thinking of themselves as outdoors people, but then they realize, like, oh, my city park down the street, or oh, this strip of grass, or oh, whatever it is, it's being funded by this, and it's at risk of being taken away, which may take away the designation of this land. And if we can hit the more diverse group of people, we're hopefully able to hit a wider group of people and then kind of rally them all behind the same message.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Matt.